The Yukon, 1949. This is a pictorial story of an expedition sent into the Bonnet Plume district of the northern Yukon. P.E. Olson. Ye Map. Introducing Phil Olson. Scotty McLeod. Ches Evans. Scotty and I left Vancouver, BC on May 11, 1949 on the Princess Louise, bound for Skagway and the Yukon. Our quest was for iron, reported by various men to exist in the Bonnet Plume in the northern Yukon. Scotty was bored stiff for most of the boat trip, but he did amuse himself, amused others too, by playing shuffleboard. Along the way, our boat passed smaller and slower boats, which appeared against beautiful backdrops of mountains and water. As we steamed along the Alaskan coast, dolphins by the hundreds swam about and gamboled in the bow wave of our boat. At times, the sea seemed alive with these strange mammals. By this time, I was thoroughly acquainted with the boat and a few of the fairer sex who were going my way. Colleen was very obliging in some respects. She loved to pose for pictures and also loved to take in the dances on board ship. During the days, we would lounge about and shoot the breeze. Very interesting. The scenery was terrific and the weather first class. Every time we had a chance, we would go ashore to see the sights. The scenery was terrific. At Juneau, Colleen and I went ashore and thence to the bubble room of the Baranoff Hotel to drink and dance. We did considerable of both and returned to the dock in time to see pulling out. Luckily, the skipper saw us and pulled back in, but I took an awful kidding. Scotty and I left the birds and the boat and Colleen at Skagway and by rail for Whitehorse on May 15. The rail trip was very colorful. After a brief stay in Whitehorse, Scotty and I left for Mayo, 250 air miles north of Whitehorse. We were greeted in Mayo by Indians, dogs, and 24 hours of daylight, none of which attracted me a great deal. Shortly after our arrival, the ice began to go out on the Stewart River. Hissing, grinding, pounding, ice continued to pass Mayo for about 5 days, and the Stewart rose higher and higher. Spring was late, so we obliged ourselves to stay in Mayo. We rented a cabin, but were flooded out, so we set up our tents. Scotty and I acquired a couple of pack dogs and amused ourselves as best we could. I recall that the average person eligible to buy liquor in Mayo spends $600 per annum on booze. At intervals, sternwheelers came to Mayo from the Yukon River. Freight costs are 5 cents per pound. During the wait in Mayo, I made several trips to the United Kino workings, Elsa and Kino City. On June 19, Scotty and I hired a third man, Chester Evans, and were very pleased with him indeed. Ches had been to the Firth River in the Arctic and was otherwise experienced in the bush. On June 20, Pat Callison arrived in his Fairchild 24 and attempted to fly us into Bonnet Plume Lake, but it was still iced over. However, we got into Ortal Lake about 35 miles southwest of Bonnet Plume Lake. We set up camp on Ortal Lake and planned on having Pat return around the 1st of July. Scotty, Ches, and I scouted around Ortal Lake and Mountain, but found the area mineralogically unfavorable. Pat returned on July the 1st and moved Scotty and Ches up to Bonnet Plume Lake, now half clear of ice. I flew in on the following day, a very pleasant trip. The country was still rather snowy, but very lovely too. South Peak, directly across the lake from our camp, was lovely to behold and a challenge to climb because of avalanches and snow cornices. We set July 20 as our next rendezvous with Pat, and he left for Dawson. At last we were at Bonnet Plume Lake, and pleased as could be. We had lots of grub and caribou tracks were very abundant. While building a cache at our camp to render our supplies safe from bears, I tried to cut my leg off with an axe. So I was obliged to stay in camp while Scotty and Ches left for a 10-day trip. They took Killer Dick, our big dog, with them. Actually, my leg did not pain me, but the cut, 5 inches below my right knee, removed some shin bone. Well, I was left alone. They left. The day Ches and Scotty left, a nice fat bull caribou tried to swim the lake and enter my tent door, so I replenished the meat supply. Perhaps I should have stayed in camp, but the mountains looked good for climbing, and my leg felt okay. Whitey, the white dog, loved the snow and wind, so I took him with me on my climbs. Abundance of snow made the climbing tough, but the weather was fine. The mountains were terrific, but some peaks were inaccessible due to snow batches and snow cornices. South Peak across the lake from my camp seemed to scoff at me and challenge me for a climb. I built a sail raft one day, tackled the peak next. The sun was bright and hot, so slides were frequent from the cornices along the top. Climbing to within 1,000 feet of the peak was easy, but then came the cliffs and avalanche chutes. I arrived on top about 3 p.m., just as a thunderstorm hit. As I was taking pictures, I could feel my hair stand on end. I had to get down very fast, so I skirted the bluffs around the peak and hit for a hard snow slide stretching 2/3 down the mountain. As I was boot skiing down the snow, the storm broke, and I made with the speed. At 4:30, I was at the lake edge, safe but very wet. My bad leg had taken a beating, so I decided to lay off climbing for a while. On the ensuing days that I was alone, I prospected most of the streams within a day's travel of camp. A herd of caribou swam the lake in front of my camp one morning at 5:30, but my picture of them was not very successful. On July 12, the boys returned to the lake, but I was out on a trip up the South Fork of the Bonnet Plume River, so I missed them. They reported no finds, just lots of high water. We were very unheartened, but decided to work the south part for another week. Scotty took a bath in the lake, but didn't get very wet. There was still ice in the lake. On the next few days, we traveled around within 15 miles of the lake, but found nothing. We did see a strange, large slide, though. On July 16, Ches and I started on a 100-mile trip to the Nadaline River, across the Ogilvy Mountains, and back to the lake. This was a good trip. Discarded horns were plentiful, the traveling was good, and the weather fair, so we made good distances in spite of heavy packs. Whitey proved a good pack dog. The Nadaline Valley was lovely, and moose were plentiful, but hard to photograph. Ches and I had to travel mostly by guess and by compass, as most of the area was unmapped. Luckily, we found good traveling and good passes. The many glaciers and snowslides added to the scenic beauty. We found nothing of economic interest, no iron. After our return to the lake, Ches and I looked longingly at Castle Mountain and fairly itched for a climb, but we never did get the chance. On the eve of our return, a grizzly dropped in on our camp, but I dispatched with a shot from my .30-30. On July 22, Pat C. and Jim Ballantyne flew in to complete our rendezvous. The weather was lovely when the plane came in. From Bonnet Plume Lake, we flew down the Bonnet Plume River to Fairchild, 100 miles. In this region, the Bonnet Plume River was a big stream. Upon arriving at Fairchild, our hopes rose and we prospected with renewed vigor. We set up camp and a cache on the lake and then set out down the Bonnet Plume. We set up another camp under Copper Mountain and there spotted our first Dall sheep. Next morning, while climbing on the crags looking over the copper deposit, I saw and bowled over a young ram for meat. Of course, the occasion called for pictures. A little downriver from there, we found our first iron pure float, so we made camp and planned to find the source. Too bad, the iron came from small stringers associated with the copper. Oddly, the iron was near the mouth of a small glacier, hence the pictures. Once more we shouldered our outfit and trekked down the river. We found no hematite, so our sadness grew. I took a snap looking downstream from the point where we started back. Upon our return to Fairchild Lake, we found all in order, so we reclined in the sun for a few days and watched moose swim the lake. Pat arrived on August 2nd and stayed overnight. Next day he flew Scotty to Bear Lake at 5,000 feet, but Scotty saw no trees, so he said no dice and did not land. Pat and Scotty returned. Ches and I regarded this for a moment and decided that it was up our alley. Pat flew us in with 2 weeks' supplies and the 30-30. We also took Whitey. Once at the lake, we cached most of our grub under some rocks and started downstream to camp in timber. After traveling for 7 miles, we found good dry timber and we made camp. We looked around for a few days, but found the prospecting very poor. We saw several sheep, and on August 6th, decided to move back to Bear Lake and hunt along the way. We spotted 2 big rams, so decided on them. The hunt was planned and executed with perfection, so at 12:30 I had them in my sights. 5 shots killed them both. The weather was good when I shot the rams, so I took some color pictures of them too. At 2 o'clock a storm broke over us, but we pushed on to Bear Lake, heavily laden and tired. It really rained. Then it closed in, then got dark. Our packs were over 100 pounds each. It was dark, the rain was heavy and driving in our faces. After the last 4-mile climb, we arrived at the lake and set up camp. We had carried 2 7-foot poles from the tree line, but had no firewood. Ches and I were stormed in for 3 days and finally had to move to timber. We went 15 miles down the Bear River before we found trees, and it stormed and fogged all the way. Once in the trees, we set up the tent and built a big fire, and that fire felt good. Soon after this, the storm let up and the sun came out. The Bear River was big and cold at our camp, but could be forded in places. The valley was wide and the river widely braided too. We prospected for 3 days from our new camp, but found nothing, so we returned to Bear Lake to await the plane. Upon our return to the lake, we found that our old camp had been uprooted by a bear, a grizzly. We had 2 days to wait, so we climbed and photographed. The mountains had typical Rocky Mountain branded structures. Ches and I encountered a strange type of stream which eroded along the limestone bedding. This rare type of stream bed is caused by homoclinal shift along taps of hard beds. Whitey loved to climb with us and often beat us to the peak. He had 4 stout legs and he loved the high winds that always blew up high. One traveler to Bear Lake described it as bleak and unfriendly. Reminds me of a girlfriend I once had, bleached and friendly. However, I must say, I'll never forget my sojourn on this lake. Never. On August 15, Pat returned to pick us up. We were out of food and worn out, but we made him welcome in our barren land camp. Our takeoff was grim, having a full load of 5,000 pounds. Run number 1 left us on the water. We waited for the wind and tried again. We cleared the water and banked a turn at the end of the lake. Then the wind stopped and we dropped. We bounced off the water and carried on, but we three were a bit scared. Eventually, we were droning on to Kathleen Lakes, where Pat had dropped Scotty off earlier that day. Scotty had been in Mayo for 2 weeks, so he was ready to hear our stories and admire the trophies. The mountains around Kathleen Lakes are quite rounded and low, not like Bear Lake. Ches and I were glad to be among trees again. There was plenty of game sighing around the lakes and in the mountains, and the evenings were lovely. We built a raft to navigate the lakes. From Kathleen Lakes we traveled around quite a bit but found very little, although we did find jasperite and hematite in the nearby Rockler River. The grade was very low. Scotty's balance was none too good and he could not swim, so stream crossing was his occupational hazard. The weather was fair and the traveling easy. Stopping for lunch was bad as a result of mosquito activities. Kathleen Lake's fishing was unsurpassed. By this time, August was